that in this job that I have, I am surrounded by care. Marge's sensitivity to the fact that I do have to leave and wanting to make sure that I have adequate time and the like to provide a greeting to you all is just an illustration of that. This is important work. I'm really glad that you all are here. It's also multifaceted work. And it's a little bit like the journey to the East in the sense that there are many different ways that people have a story of telling themselves about what they're doing and what they're engaged in, and finally people are there based upon their own motivation and their own perspective. And therefore, I know that the next 2 weeks will be really full and engaging as those different agendas get dealt with and people advance the journey that they're on. I want to just maybe to put this a little bit in a bigger context, and I know that many of you have heard me talk before, and therefore some of this may be repetitious, but anyway, it's maybe repeating, and there are other folks that have not heard this, so let me just share a few things here. I came to this job primarily because I was convinced that the wisdom of our past needed an institutional vehicle to continue. And that I was passionate about trying to figure that out. And I came with 3 big major challenges when I took this job. And the way I talked about those, one was just getting on top of the finances. And I won't spend much time on that, but I will tell you that we just finished the audit almost is finished. We had the auditor here last week. But we have now 3 successive years of finishing operationally in black. As much as, anyway, that is a piece of ensuring institutional stability and the like. The other thing, the big challenge, and I don't want to dwell on that so much, but the other 2 big challenges were, one, taking the wisdom and insights of our past and creating new dynamic programs that are engaged in the challenges of today. And certainly one of those challenges, in my perspective, is dealing with the huge crisis that all of society around the world, human society, is experiencing, and that is if we don't find new ways of living and functioning on this earth, the future is very bleak. And I think that as I talked in the past about building a just and equitable society, that was a part of my motivation, the way I talked about the mission of this organization. I didn't have a full understanding about what it means to talk about sustainability. It wasn't a major perspective. I was primarily concerned about economic justice and social engagement and all kinds of things like this. The truth is, I used to give the God lecture. Most of you know what I mean when I say the God lecture. And my primary illustration in 1970 about floating around the world and floating and not making a serious decision and not being engaged had to do with the very first Earth Day. I was totally convinced that the huge crisis that we were facing in terms of society, and you have to go back to 1970 and see where we were. Kent State had just happened. And of course we were still dealing with civil rights types of issues and so on and so forth. And I would say, and here are the big challenges of trying to deal with the moral issues of our times, and instead of engaging in that, people just stand back, hold hands, and say, oh, I love the earth, let's talk about the rainbow. I am now in an act of social repentance because I did not get it. It took a long time for me to get it. And today, I want to say part of the challenge, and certainly the mission of ICA, is build a just and equitable society in harmony with planet Earth. And therefore, the kind of programs that we are about creating, I feel like, are taking that kind of perspective and creating new dynamic kind of programs. So anyway, that's part of what I've been involved in, and I understand that there's time, Marge, later in the week or sometime where you want me to kind of give a programmatic update. So I'm not going to do that now, but I want to come and talk about it. The other big challenge for me when I took this job was, and this comes back to the institutional perspective, but that's to ensure that succession happens to a new generation of leadership in this organization. And part of that has to do with conveying the wisdom, the hard-won lessons that came out of the last 50 years. And many of us have been around in those last 50 years. Those lessons didn't come easy. They came at a great cost. How do we ensure that is continued and perpetuated in the future? And when I say this, part of what I mean by that is that if we don't find a way of ensuring that wisdom gets freighted into a new time, the ICA becomes the Institute of something else. It's not the Institute of Cultural Affairs, it's the Institute of something else. And therefore I'm very concerned about how do we ensure that core wisdom gets conveyed into the future. So let me give you an illustration. I want to tell a little bit of story. This is where some of you have already heard this, but I'll just repeat it. You're going to have a chance, and I'm really eager in the next 2 weeks, to have our staff, our young staff, engaged with you in different kinds of occasions and interaction. And I think that that's a two-way street, that it's valuable to you and it's valuable to them. And I can tell you this already. They love hearing stories. And quite frankly, when some of them hear about washing grave plots, it's a little much for them. But they sense there's something really important there. And so they love hearing those kind of stories about what people have done, where they've been, and what they've engaged in, and the like. And I understand that the primary means for doing that is going to be wine and cheese.
Good. That's fine.
And
so
so
I don't know where or when those are going to be, but there's a staff meeting at 1 o'clock. Unfortunately, because of my tie and this conference I have to be present to downtown, I'm not going to be at the staff meeting at 1. But they're eager to hear when are those wine and cheeses scheduled so they can get them in. So if you all talk, Marge, maybe at 1 o'clock, or if you send a representative of that staff, kind of get it there so they're ready and ready to be here. Now, new programs, transition, succession for new staff, new generation. Let me give you a little story. We've had a number, as you know, we've been working with universities. It's a major piece of our new work that we're attempting to do, and of course there's nothing new. It's where we started in Austin, working with universities. But we've had a number of different groups come and do different kinds of tasks, and one of the groups was from the University of Illinois in Chicago. And they were here to talk about how do we create a green culture within this building and what might be some keys for doing this culture. And Seva Gandhi, one of her jobs, and those of you who have not met Seva, she's one of the dynamic young staff people here, she oversees this internship work, university connection work, and voluntary work. And anyway, she was getting ready to do an orientation with them, and I believe almost as an afterthought, she said, Terry, could you come in and say a little bit about culture? And what's ICA mean by culture? And so, as unaccustomed as I am to speaking extemporaneously, I said, yes, I'll be happy to do that. Well, I came and what I did is that I talked about culture and how, to put it into a big context, I talked about the social imbalances and how that today, and quite frankly throughout our lifetime, the social process of the economic, the political, and the cultural has been so dominated by an economic perspective, and a very particular economic perspective today. And quite frankly, I would say it's more extreme than when we first created that imbalance picture. It's driven by the market. If you don't do something and you don't have market justification, it is meaningless. It is insignificant. And everything is over against a perspective of the market. And of course, our political supports this, and the cultural dimension, our values and other kinds of perspectives have just been lost, and are very marginalized, let's say it that way. So anyway, I did this kind of speech, and I said, and therefore what we've done, either you can butt your head directly into the economic, but good luck to that. You know, how's that working out for those of you who do that? Or you can begin to address and empower the cultural dimensions of the social process. And that's what we're about doing. Well, anyway, I gave this speech, and these students asked a bunch of questions, and then they set the stage, and they did a fabulous job in the particular task they had for the next semester and on. What really caught me was after that meeting, Seva came and said, Terry, I've never heard that before. Well, where did that come from? How, you know, and I was just totally struck with the fact that even though I try to be very, very self-conscious about conveying some of our wisdom and passing it on, how mammoth of a task that is to hand over things that you and I and many of us have lived and breathed and have hard-won lessons with. Well, anyway, the follow-up of this is that, you know, we've been doing this series of conferences with Oklahoma City University, and last year we did a conference, and anyway, there's always been big, powerful speakers at these conferences. Well, last year it turned out that Seva and I were going to do a joint ICA presentation at this conference. Well, I wanted Seva to be in the forefront, and she did this. And her whole presentation basically had to deal with the social imbalances. And what does it mean to address the social imbalances? And I tell you, hearing her talk to that group, it was the turning point of the conference, her presentation on this. And if you have any doubts, whenever you see Jim Troxell, ask him. He was there, and he's the one who was very, very clear about this. Well, to me, that's an illustration of part of what we want to accomplish with the archives. It has to do with making our wisdom, our hard-won wisdom, the lessons learned from that, accessible to invigorating the new programmatic work that this institution needs to continue. That is, if it's going to be the Institute of Cultural Affairs rather than the Institute of something else. And therefore, the accessibility of that wisdom is what I'm passionate about. And again, this is in the interest of, some of you have already seen this, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it out again. But one of the concerns that I've had, and I think it is related to the archives, is how do we convey this not only to new staff in terms of orientation, but also new board people. And so this is a little project that I've worked on, and part of the challenge in my mind is we have so much wisdom. How do you summarize it, and how would you talk about it? Anyway, I used a little tool in a 4x4, and the wisdom of the 4x4, and I tried to do this. And so this may not be right and whatever, but we need one way. And of course, I know that finally, how you all categorize the archives, a 4x4 doesn't quite handle all the data, and you've got much more. But just let me illustrate one little box. There's one down here called 2C, and it's called, you know, one of the core pieces of our wisdom that I think is crucial to hand over. It says behavior changes occur when image changes. Well, how do we convey that kind of wisdom to people like Seva and Nina and other new staff, and empower them to transform it in a way that Seva did down at Oklahoma City University, so that it's living and breathing and dynamic about now, rather than, you know, just with how we talked about it in the past. Well, that's just one illustration that I think is a crucial task that we're about.
This is awesome. This is awesome.
Well, thank you very much.
Terry, to speak to that box, we've had some night conversations about the context paragraph before every collection or program, and it's this. We're saying we'll just start with that sentence. We're not going to, but the importance of that underlies everything we do. That's why we did it. I mean, that's.
I know this has been why people would buy airplane tickets and come here, and why you would stop doing what you're doing and come here. And I just say all of this to remind you that it is important, and I'm really grateful for you.
This is great.
Thank you very much.
Terrific.
And I want to add one word, which is Terry's Seva story. We have hundreds of people around the world in that position who are trying to figure out, they know they're part of something fantastic,
Yes.
but they're trying to figure out how, you know, what their story is and what the essence is and all these kind of, and they've tasted something in their journey that said this is it, this is right, but they're still trying to expand that into true understanding.
And this is simplification, but Elise and George have done a new course on the image, and our people went, and the building construction manager went, Damien. And after that weekend, he came and sat next to me, and he said, Jean, I now understand who you are and why you are and what, I mean, so.
So we should check with him.
No, we should check. See if this is right. But anyway, these courses are critical because they created us too. And so, this is terrific. Just try to get on stage.
Okay, continue this dialogue. Thank you very much.